L'État, c'est moi.
I am the state.
Right. It's one of the most famous quotes in history, usually pinned to Louis XIV of France. And, it's almost always read as this staggering assertion of ego, like the ultimate arrogance.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very dramatic opening for a meeting.
Yeah, but if you really look at the machinery he built, it's not just boasting, it's actually a literal declaration of political intent. He isn't just claiming power, he's claiming to be the physical embodiment of the national infrastructure.
And you're completely right to look past the ego there. That phrase, it perfectly encapsulates the massive structural shift we are unpacking today. Because we aren't just looking at guys in fancy wigs.
We are looking at the invention of the modern state itself, which is exactly what we're going to explore in this deep dive into European absolutism. We're covering a very specific, very volatile window here, roughly 1648 to 1815.
Right. The era where Europe transitions from a messy patchwork of feudal obligations and local warlords into centralized nations under supreme authority.
And to understand why this happened and why it matters to you today, we have to start with the context. We're picking up the thread right after the Peace of Westphalia.
Which is crucial, because Westphalia didn't just end the 30 Years' War, it effectively established the concept of state sovereignty.
Basically telling foreign powers, hey, stay out of our domestic business, especially when it comes to religion.
Exactly. And that lack of external interference gave monarchs a giant green light to consolidate power internally. But there's another layer here. The religious wars had been incredibly exhausting.
Right. The Catholic Church was losing its grip.
Yes. For centuries, the Church acted as this supranational check on kings. But fractured by the Reformation, its political capital was totally drained.
So you've got this massive power vacuum, the church is receding, the local feudal lords are totally exhausted from fighting. But here is the really counterintuitive part that popped out in the research. The merchants. We usually frame this era as the king versus the people, right? But the sources suggest the rise of absolutism was actually supported and even funded by the merchant class.
It sounds completely contradictory at first glance. Why would merchants, who historically despise taxes, support a king who claims to own absolutely everything?
Right. It makes no sense until you look at the alternative.
Exactly. Put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah.
If you were a merchant in, say, 1650, and you're trying to move a cart of wool from Paris to the coast.
We were passing through lands owned by like 5 different dukes.
At least 5. And each one demands a toll. Each one has entirely different local laws. They use different weights, different measures.
It's a complete logistical nightmare. You're dealing with 50 local robber barons just to get your product to market.
So the merchant class looks at the king, and they see an opportunity for standardization. They're willing to trade some political freedom and pay taxes to a central authority if and only if that authority can guarantee safe roads, uniform tariffs, and a single legal code.
They're buying stability. It's a pure transaction.
Precisely. Order is good for business.
But even with the merchants totally on board, the would-be absolute monarch still has a massive obstacle in the way. The nobility. The old aristocracy.
The guys who used to run the show.
Right, because these aren't just rich guys in manors, these are warrior clans. They have their own private armies, they have centuries of autonomy. You can't just ask them nicely to hand over the keys to the castle.
No, and you can't just execute them all either. I mean, not unless you want a massive civil war that destroys the very country you're trying to rule.
So what do you do with them?
You have to domesticate them.
Which brings us to what we can call the architecture of control. And I don't mean that as metaphor. I literally mean the Palace of Versailles.
Louis XIV's absolute masterpiece.
It's so easy to look at Versailles as just this massive vanity project, just a gross display of wealth. But the historical analysis suggests it was actually a highly sophisticated political prison.
The golden cage. That's the exact term used for it. Louis XIV instituted this requirement that the high nobility, the nobles of the sword as they were called, had to spend a significant portion of the year living at Versailles.
Which, sounds lovely, living in a palace, until you realize the strategic implication. You are physically removing these incredibly powerful men from their provincial power bases.
Yes, you are taking them away from the tenants who pay them rent, away from the local militias who are loyal to their family name.
And you're putting them in an environment where the king controls the lights, the heat, and the schedule.
And the finances. You can't forget the finances. Life at Versailles was ruinously expensive. You had to dress a certain way. You were expected to gamble at the king's tables, throw lavish parties.
So he's bleeding them dry?
He essentially engaged the nobility in a war of attrition against their own bank accounts. Because if you went into massive debt trying to keep up appearances, who did you have to ask for a royal pension?
The king. It created this perfect dependency loop. But I really want to talk about the rituals here, because the sources describe these intricate mourning ceremonies, the lever.
Oh, the shirt.
Yes, where grown, incredibly powerful nobles would aggressively compete for the quote-unquote honor of holding the king's candle or handing him his shirt in the morning. To modern ears, it just sounds absurd.
It sounds like a comedy sketch, but it was brilliant behavior modification. Louis turned the aristocracy's ambition entirely inward. Instead of plotting rebellions back home or debating tax policy, these guys were obsessing over who got to stand closest to the monarch at dinner.
It completely neutralized them as a political threat by turning them into courtiers.
Exactly.
But wait, if the old nobility is entirely occupied with fighting over who gets to hold the royal shirt, who is actually running the country?
And that is where the true genius of the system lies. Louis didn't trust the great nobles with actual governance anyway, so instead he built a parallel administration. He radically expanded the system of intendants.
These were the middle-class bureaucrats,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Lawyers, merchants, minor gentry. Men whose entire status and livelihood depended solely on their competence and the king's favor. They had no independent power base.
So they're basically avatars of the king.
That is a very apt way to put it. Louis sent these intendants out to the provinces to collect taxes, enforce laws, oversee the army.
They were the operating system of the state. The nobles were just the branding.
Yes. The intendants bypassed the local governors entirely. If you were a peasant or a merchant, you quickly realized that the local duke might have the fancy title and the nice coat, but the intendant had the direct line to Paris. It was the birth of the modern administrative state.
A professional bureaucracy answering only to the central executive. Now, France is the classic example of this. Let's call it a seduction strategy. But I want to pivot to the East. Because in Russia, Peter the Great looked at what was happening in France and decided he wanted that absolute power.
But he didn't really have the patience for seduction.
No, he preferred a sledgehammer.
Well, Peter's situation was vastly different. Russia was geographically massive, it was isolated, and it was technologically far behind the West. For Peter, absolutism wasn't just about stroking his ego, it was a vital survival mechanism.
He needed to force march Russia into the 18th century.
Right, and he started with the aesthetics. We have to discuss cultural control and the beard tax.
It is legendary for a reason, but it wasn't just a quirky fashion police thing. In the Russian Orthodox tradition, the beard was a profound symbol of religious piety, of your literal connection to God.
So by forcing the nobility to shave, Peter wasn't just updating their look to match the French. It was a calculated psychological break.
It was essentially a syntax on tradition.
That's exactly what it was. You could keep your beard if you really wanted to, but you had to pay a steep tax and carried a copper token. A literal receipt of your backwardness worn right around your neck.
It was monetized public shaming. He was physically branding them to show that the old Russian identity was now completely subordinate to the new secular identity of the state.
And he didn't stop at facial hair. He completely overhauled the entire institutional structure with the table of ranks.
Which connects right back to our merchant theme from earlier about efficiency.
Yes. Peter realized that a status system based solely on who your parents were was incredibly inefficient. You might have a duke who is a complete and utter incompetent leading an army. The table of ranks established that your status was determined strictly by your service to the state.
Either in the military, the civil service, or the court. So it was a meritocracy.
I would call it a weaponized meritocracy.
Yeah.
It allowed talented commoners to rise up the ranks, which gave Peter this fiercely loyal pool of administrators. But crucially, it also forced the old nobility to actually get to work.
You couldn't just quote-unquote be noble anymore. You had to do something for the czar to maintain your standing.
Exactly. And to cement this absolute control, he even went after the church. He essentially nationalized it.
Right, because when the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church died, Peter just didn't appoint a new one.
He just let the position sit empty. And then he replaced the patriarchate entirely with the Holy Synod, which was essentially a committee of state officials.
Imagine a Department of Religious Affairs. He turned the church into a branch of the government.
He eliminated the only alternative center of power in Russia.
Okay, so in both France and Russia, we see this massive, sweeping consolidation. The king controls the nobles, the administration, the church, the culture. But all of this, the palaces, the standing armies, the massive bureaucracy, it costs an absolute fortune.
It does.
So how are they paying for this? What is the wallet behind absolutism?
This brings us to the economic engine of the era. You really can't separate the politics from the money. In France, the primary architect of this was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister, and his underlying philosophy was mercantilism.
We hear that term thrown around a lot in history, but let's break down the actual mechanics of it, because it's not just about trade. It's a very specific, almost paranoid view of the world.
It is a fundamentally zero-sum worldview. Mercantilism holds that there is a fixed, finite amount of wealth in the world. So for France to be rich, England or the Netherlands must literally become poorer.
Which explains the intense regulation and the industrial espionage. Like the stories of Colbert secretly luring Venetian glassblowers to France to steal their mirror-making secrets. That wasn't just cutthroat business competition, that was official state policy.
Absolutely. He imposed brutal tariffs on foreign goods to protect domestic French industry. He aggressively expanded colonial holdings. And he built a navy to secure those colonies, not just for the prestige of it, but to guarantee a steady supply of raw materials so France didn't have to buy them from anyone else.
It was economic warfare.
It was. But as brilliant as Colbert was, there was a massive flaw in the design of absolutism. The state became incredibly wealthy, yes. But where did all that money go?
It went straight into war. And I think this is the grand tragedy of the system. Louis XIV spent the last decades of his reign in almost constant grinding conflict.
And we have to remember, war in the late 17th century had changed dramatically.
Right, we aren't talking about knights showing up for 40 days of feudal service anymore. We're talking about massive star forts, artillery, gunpowder.
And huge standing professional armies, hundreds of thousands of men, which are exponentially more expensive to maintain than feudal levies. You have to feed them, clothe them, arm them, and pay them year-round.
So Louis XIV basically drained the treasury as fast as Colbert could fill it.
Faster, eventually. And we see an even starker example of this economic failure in Spain. Spain had all the gold and silver from the Americas flowing in, mountains of it.
But they didn't develop the domestic industry to actually back it up.
Right. They just spent the gold on massive foreign wars and the Spanish Armada. It caused rampant, crippling inflation. And when those gold shipments eventually slowed down or got intercepted by pirates, the Spanish state practically collapsed under its own weight.
They had the absolutist ambition, but they completely lacked the sustainable economic engine.
Exactly. Military and financial overextension was the Achilles heel of the absolute monarch.
No, we've painted a picture of this wave of absolutism sweeping across Europe, changing the fabric of these nations. But there is one glaring exception in the sources. The one major power that looked at this centralized model and basically said, no thank you.
England.
Right, why not England?
England is the fascinating counterexample here. And it's definitely not for lack of trying on the monarchy's part. King James I and his son Charles III were actually very keen on the French model.
James was a massive, vocal proponent of the divine right of kings, the idea that his authority came directly from God and could not be questioned by any earthly body.
He wrote books on it. But he ran into a structural wall that Louis and Peter simply didn't have to deal with.
He ran into Parliament.
Yes. And specifically, he ran into the power of the purse.
Which goes all the way back to the Magna Carta, doesn't it?
It does. The Magna Carta established a deep legal tradition in England that the king could not levy new taxes without the formal consent of the realm. Now, in the medieval era, a king could sometimes just live off the rents from his own personal lands.
But as we just discussed, the math of modern warfare completely changed that.
Precisely. The king now needed vastly more money than he personally owned just to build a functional state. So when Charles I wanted to build a modern fleet or raise an army to suppress a rebellion in Scotland, he had to go to Parliament and ask for funds.
And Parliament essentially said, sure, we will give you the money, but in exchange, we want political concessions. We want a say in actual policy.
And Charles said absolutely not. He tried to rule without them for over a decade. He tried to resurrect bizarre old medieval fines. He tried to squeeze money out of the existing system in every creative, unpopular way possible.
But the king's credit card effectively got declined.
That's a great way to look at it. He couldn't generate enough steady structural revenue to build the kind of crushing, loyal bureaucracy that Louis had in France. He couldn't pay a massive standing army to enforce his will because Parliament controlled the money supply.
Which creates a friction that ultimately triggers the English Civil War. It's just amazing to think that the entire divergence of European history, France heading toward absolute despotism and England heading toward constitutional monarchy, basically hinged on who controlled the treasury.
Structural checks on financial power proved to be the only truly effective defense against absolutism.
Mm.
Because without the money, the ideology of divine right is really just talk.
So we've covered the mechanics, we've covered the economics and the failures, but I want to ask the big so what question. For you, the average person living in France or Russia at this time, did any of this really matter, or was it just rich people fighting other rich
Oh,
people?
it mattered immensely.
Okay.
Because absolute power demands absolute uniformity.
Mhm.
If the king is the physical embodiment of the state, then to be a loyal subject, you must be exactly like the king.
There's zero tolerance for difference. We see this incredibly clearly with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in France.
That was a truly pivotal, tragic moment in 1685. Louis XIV decided that having a religious minority in his country was a sign of political weakness. He effectively made Protestantism illegal overnight.
He literally sent dragoons, armed soldiers, to forcibly live in the homes of Protestant families, to terrorize them into converting to Catholicism.
And the blowback from that was immediate and severe. It was a massive self-inflicted wound. The Huguenots, the French Protestants, were disproportionately skilled workers.
They were the weavers, the watchmakers, the bankers, the merchants we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And when they fled France to escape the persecution, they took all of that human capital, all of those skills, directly to England, to the Netherlands, to Prussia.
So Louis essentially gifted his biggest economic rivals his own tax base.
He did. In his obsessive quest for religious and political purity, he gutted his own economy. It perfectly highlights the central tension of absolutism. The relentless drive for control often destroys the very vitality of the nation you're trying to build.
Okay, as we wrap this deep dive up, I want to look at the legacy. Because we usually view the French Revolution as the definitive end of this era. The people rise up, the king loses his head, and absolutism is over. Boom, history moves on.
That is definitely the popular narrative. But look closer at the actual machinery we've been describing today. The centralized tax collection, the conscripted professional army, the intrusive police state, the massive bureaucracy.
The revolutionaries didn't dismantle any of that, did they?
Not at all. They actually expanded it. The French Republic and later Napoleon used the exact tools that Louis XIV built to mobilize the nation more totally than any king ever could have dreamed of.
That is a genuinely haunting thought. Louis said, I am the state. The revolution didn't kill the state, it just swapped out the owner.
Precisely. The modern nation-state, with its ability to tax your income, draft you into the military, and regulate your commerce from hundreds of miles away, is the direct, unbroken heir of European absolutism. We essentially democratized the absolute power, but we didn't diminish it.
So the massive infrastructure of control that Peter and Louis built is still humming along today. We just get to vote on who sits at the desk.
That is the reality. The bureaucracy outlived the bloodlines.
Well, on that slightly terrifying, provocative note, we are going to close the file on absolutism. It's a powerful reminder that political systems leave structural fingerprints that last centuries longer than the rulers themselves. So, something for you to mull over the next time you pay your taxes or renew your driver's license.
Indeed, it was a pleasure unpacking this with you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you on the next deep dive.